They're standing on the dock and looking out on the water. Some blue lights were flashing, and Calvin said, "Well, I told you." And the police is right here. You can see them lights flashing. They turned around. Well, the police would have been a much better outcome. It wasn't the police; it was a craft. I just say an apparent craft, and so, but I'm just going to call it a craft. That's how they reported it, and a non-ordinary, a saucer type or oblong, etc. And they were immediately paralyzed with fear and maybe paralyzed with some other force. A door opened up seamlessly. Out came two.
UFOs, this conversation we talked a little bit before we started recording, it seems to be growing in its traction. People want to hear more about it. People want it more and more on especially platforms like podcasts. It's a topic that we get asked about a lot. Can you reach out to this person? Can you speak about this? UFOs is a growing topic in this space. Everyone's curious about it. Why do you think now? Why is this becoming more and more popular every day at this point in time?
Good question. There's a shift that has happened around 2017. The New York Times in December of 2017 published a good piece of journalism, and it revealed that, contrary to the idea, to the U.S. government's assertion that there's nothing going on here, well, we're not tracking anything. Go home, people, to your little lives. Everything is fine. We're managing everything you need to know, that sort of thing. In fact, we now know the government, the Pentagon had an office that was actually investigating phenomena, which interestingly, they gave the UFO acronym an acronym upgrade from UFO to UAP. And that indicates their recognition that UFO had become so contaminated with all the cultural references, flying saucers, little green men, and all of that. And so they decided to go with unidentified aerial phenomena, or even now it's called unidentified anomalous phenomena. But in any case, that put on the map the idea for especially the new generation, millennial, Gen Z. Wow, not only did they have they been following it and tracking it, and then they have an office which they didn't admit to having, maybe we're closer to disclosure. The idea that the government has all the answers or has significant answers, and those answers will now be revealed. My approach as kind of a long-term observer of this phenomenon is that the idea has been in play for 8 decades, easily. And the idea being, any day now, the lid on that government cover-up is going to blow sky high. We're finally reached there. There's no turnaround, and so forth. And I say that with some irony, because, it's not my first rodeo, not my first UFO rodeo. But at the same time, there are some indications that some kind of greater transparency is underway. So I think that is the media coverage has increased. It's a good time to come out with a book on this subject. There's a little more ability to have conversations that are meaningful. So that's my first answer, kind of my first go around to how it seems to be in the air right now.
And another thing I find really interesting is that, if you go back 5-10 years, if we were having these conversations or these topics or sightings, or just the conversations were being had on mainstream media, or you were seeing, official government agencies or bodies recognizing terms like UFO, UAP, or even just discussing the idea, it would be sort of groundbreaking news. Everyone wouldn't be able to believe it. But now it seems as though, I don't know if it's a case of just being drip fed this information over a certain level of time, but the new sort of normal seems to have been shifted, where people don't seem to be as blown away by things as they come out these days. I was talking to Daniel Sheehan recently on this podcast. The podcast was very, very well received, and he was talking about this piece of government legislation that meant that by October 18th, later this year, that certain information had to be disclosed. And we couldn't believe that more people weren't talking about this. Have you noticed that now, where people's reaction to these conversations or people's reactions to government news seem to be a little, more receptive? They don't seem to be as blown away by the idea anymore.
Exactly. There is a kind of habituation to it, acculturation. Um, there has been a kind of a giggle factor, to be sure. The Somebody called it the laughter curtain comes down whenever the subject is discussed. Going back, for example, in the United States to 1947, the pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who was flying a private plane over Mount Rainier in the Pacific Northwest. He's a very skilled pilot. He knew what he was doing. He looked out his windshield and saw 9 objects flying in formation at remarkable speeds. Because he was an experienced pilot, he was able to calibrate the speed right away. He called it into the tower where he was headed in Pendleton, Oregon, and that's might be where he first used the phrase, they skip like saucers would over a body of water. Skip like saucers would if they were going over water, almost like we think of a flying saucer or frisbee, the toy. So by the time he landed, he did not expect that the news media would be with him on the tarmac, and that's when it began. He became a public figure. They said, "What did you see?" And that the stories that got published ended up saying he said he saw objects shaped like saucers, and that's a small distinction, but it became interesting. One skeptic said, "Well, he did not actually say that he saw uh, saucers shaped, he saw objects move like saucers." And in this kind of a playful skeptic said, well, why would the extraterrestrials redesign their craft to fit a reporter's error in reporting? Now, these are the kinds of paradoxes, the information paradoxes, the logical paradoxes that are play into this from an information theory standpoint. In any case, um, he dealt the rest of his life with this idea that he was a little goofy, maybe a little off his plot, and so forth. And interestingly, one thing I reveal in the book is his daughter came forward 2 decades later after Kenneth Arnold had died, and she said, "I'm here to say that my father was always perplexed by the idea that he saw machines, that he saw hardware, that he saw nuts and bolts technology. He described to me and our mother and our other members of the family that these objects seemed to be pulsating. They were blue-white light pulsating with different degrees of density, from opaque to very translucent, and they seemed to beat like the human heart." Now, if describing something in the sky as saucer-like, moving like saucers, was far out, what he kept to himself was this more esoteric quality that, to him, according to his daughter Kim Arnold, they seem to be from another dimension, not outer space in the typical understanding, but seem to be from that place where we go after this life is over. So there were definitely, instead of extraterrestrial connotations, there were eschatological, which is a fancy theological term for matters relating to the end of time, relating to the transmigration of souls, spiritual or esoteric topics. So if this phenomenon had been identified originally in terms of that, then it would have perhaps shaped the entire way it had been reported. There's one more element I want to get to that it goes to my approach on this subject. When he got home that night, flying his plane back to Boise, Idaho, his hometown, and drove the usual drive home, got to his house, and that night there were orbs of light floating in the house, paranormal phenomena, as it were. So just kind of pause and look at that. He thought he saw something flying in the sky that would be something out there separate from him, but in some sense, he brought it home with him. And so this gets to the complexities of this topic, the difficulty in talking about a subject that clearly has a paranormal dimension, even if it is extraterrestrial or perhaps from other dimensions. This is a phenomenon that promiscuously crosses the divide that Western science insists exists between the objective and the subjective. Well, by definition, a synchronicity, which is prevalent in all paranormal type phenomena, is something that crosses that divide. So people see something in the sky and it evokes something deeply in them. That's what a psychic experience is, the telepathic experience. Those moments, for example, you're at the grocery store and you have a sense someone is looking at you. It's just you look up and someone is looking at you, and they're smiling. It's not a particularly ominous moment, but somehow you knew. How did I know that person was looking at me? There were never no cues. So this gets into all the areas that Western science doesn't particularly like to deal with because it confounds the Cartesian split between here and there. So anyway, that's Daniel Sheehan has been a good reporter on a lot of aspects of this. He's really right there now on the lobbying for this kind of disclosure. But I think we have to be prepared if we're going to be really upfront with ourselves. The disclosure will make me disclosing something far greater than what many people think, and not just magnificent machines that are being kept in the hangars of McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed Martin. But the biggest disclosure has to do with ontological issues. I don't think all of the UFO data, the evidence, can be explained in terms of the conventional scientific paradigm. We need a larger paradigm that includes phenomena that is officially non-existent, what Professor Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University calls impossible things, but things that happen. They're impossible, but they happen. As Sir William Crookes, the observer of paranormal phenomena over many decades ago, said, I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. And I think that is what most UFO witnesses end up saying to the skeptic. I never said it was possible. I don't believe it myself, but it happened.
There may be a few people out there who hear words like paranormal or spiritual, and instantly they close their mind to it. They don't want to hear anymore because for some reason, I think something extraterrestrial seems, for whatever reason, more plausible to a lot of people than something paranormal. Which of those two do you think is the more grandiose thinking? Because both are extraordinary possibilities for something to be paranormal or something to be extraterrestrial. Are they both as plausible as each other? Is one more of a reach? What do you think?
That's a good question. A couple of decades ago, two researchers, the French astrophysicist Jacques Vallée, you may be familiar with his work, and a physicist named Eric Davis wrote a paper called The Physics of High Strangeness. And in that paper, they said there is, to the best of our knowledge and the best of our reckoning, no experimental basis for distinguishing between extraterrestrial and interdimensional parallel universes, phenomena that has psychic or paranormal dimensions. At this time, there really is no phenomenologically in the way these events appear. It could be either. What many people who recoil, I understand the recoil at paranormal and even spiritual. I didn't get into this subject. I can talk at some point about how I actually did come into this subject. As a young person doing a classroom report, and I chose as my current events report the UFO phenomenon that was happening in a state near mine in the United States. I did not at that time. I was not aware of any idea that this phenomenon had paranormal connotations. That I was not aware of the paranormal as even a category at the time. If UFO is considered weird, the paranormal, very often people will say, well, okay, paranormal is an interesting idea. Psychic phenomenon. Where's the evidence? Oh, sure, we all have moments of coincidence. We pick up the phone and we suddenly think about someone we hadn't talked about for 20 years or hadn't thought of for 20 years, but we had been thinking of them that morning. And sure enough, it's Jack from high school on the phone. That's called a coincidence. You know, you grab hold of that and then you give it a special symbolic import and you've suddenly connected up all the dots in the universe. I get that kind of thinking. But I just want to say for those who recoil, don't take my word for it. Investigate the status of scientific research, well-controlled scientific research. Particularly, I'll throw out a name, Dr. Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Northern California, has been widely credited with top-level premier research, laboratory research on telepathy, clairvoyance, and mind in matter type phenomena. In many respects, the gold standard of paranormal research is so strong that it is even a higher standard of quality than most mainstream research. So yeah, I get the idea that these topics sort of challenge understanding. And I don't ask anyone to take anything on faith. I have come to accept that psychic, these phenomena are real. And and in fact, many scientists will say at a conference they've had the experiences too that have really rocked their sense of things, but they're not willing to make this part of their work for two reasons. One is it's a great way to lose funding and a great way to lose credibility. If you don't have tenure yet, stay away from psychic phenomena. If you do have tenure, you might be free to have a little latitude to explore. Secondly, they will also say, I can see there's a signal here. There is statistically evidence that telepathy was real in this case. Well, we don't know the mechanism, and so therefore, how do you deal? The mechanistic thinking requires mechanisms, right? How does information transfer? What is really the fundamental place of consciousness in our paradigm? That's what it really comes down to. And the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness develop out of inert molecules, dead matter? Well, maybe that's a non sequitur. Maybe consciousness doesn't develop out of that. Maybe consciousness is the ground of everything that is. It's the most immediate datum that we have, data that we have, and that somehow all what we call the material world is that same consciousness, but in a denser form. These move into metaphysical questions. They move into philosophical questions. But I have come to track them as a UFO tracker because they're part of the data. So my model, my mantra and my model is to sort of follow the evidence wherever it leads, and it doesn't require belief. This requires asking questions that try to account for as much of the data as possible, which is, I think, the core scientific enterprise.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant message and very interesting, because when I talked to Dr. Paul Halpern on this show, who wrote a book called The Allure of the Multiverse, we were talking about how in academia specifically, there are certain topics where people will hold themselves back from or just won't go anywhere near out of it ruining their career, or people not wanting to work with them or not taking them as serious, or as you mentioned there, losing funding or being viewed as a quack. And those topics end up being so under-researched as a result of that. It's an absolute shame. That shouldn't be what science is about. You mentioned, Dean Radin there. If we were given a little bit of an elevator pitch into this paranormal way of thinking about UFOs, what is the most compelling evidence or compelling anecdote or anything like that you could point towards where someone listening to this who may be closed-minded to this topic, it may make them sit up and listen?
Well, okay. Let me just give you the sort of direct one I often use. We have case after case where people see what appears to be a Steven Spielberg type classic mothership or a saucer with shining surfaces and with a row of windows and no sign of propulsion, hovering silently in the field. And so we find that this is picked up on radar, other sensors. We find evidence that it appears with all the marks of having showing turbulence and showing sometimes when make contact with the ground, indentations in the ground. I mean, this would pass all the sort of muster to be geometrically placed, an object in space. At the same time, these same craft are seen to suddenly split in 2 or 3 or 4, take shapes like triangles, balls of light, and some of them descend into the ground. Some of them become translucent, similar to Kenneth Arnold's sighting. So here we have something that in one phase appears as a solid object and shows and meets the requirements, the criteria of the sensors that determine this is a physical object. And then it is behaving far more like something vaporous, some form of plasma. And there's another side of this too. So right there, just in other words, it's moving through a continuum. Is it between energy and matter, between form and formlessness? So right there, there's some sense of a process we can't account for. But one way to account for it is to say, well, we know that things like that don't happen. You start with that kind of a, this is, by the way, what I call the debunker response. I differentiate between the debunker in any of these, in any of these areas, paranormal, UFO, near-death phenomena. I've come to make a connection between the UFO and the near-death phenomena, partly based on personal experience. But the commonalities between these phenomena are very strong. And another way into the paranormal is these craft appear, they're on the ground. They might be 30 feet in diameter from left to right. Then with these very, very problematic cases called alien abductions, right? Okay, there's a big category right there. The people are taken inside these craft, and they find that they're maybe 50 or 60 or 70 feet. There are different rooms inside, so there's a dilation of space. Now, again, this can't happen. That's the debunker response. The debunker is the one who simply says categorically, we know these things don't happen. These are impossible. The laws of nature tell us. Laws of nature is a funny term to hear as a general prohibition. Galileo was told that the laws of nature were such the Earth could not be orbiting the sun. He was told it by great scientific authorities from the Vatican, which was exactly not their wheelhouse at the time. Well, so anyway, I differentiate the debunker from a true skeptic. I'm a skeptic. I don't think skepticism, by the way, should be a separate category. We have organizations and magazines, the Skeptical Inquirer, the Skeptical Search. If skepticism becomes a separate category, that's usually a sign it's debunking. Skepticism should be should be baked into everything. Ask tough questions. Was it Richard Feynman who says, don't fool yourself? And remember, you're the easiest person to fool. So I'm a skeptic, including of my own assumptions. I don't believe all of this, but I'm tracking the evidence. So that's kind of a response. I don't know if that is responsive to what you've asked.
Yeah, no, and especially that idea of abductions. To me, that's always been a topic I've never really felt any compelling evidence towards. But when you think about the paranormal, that seems like a much more plausible explanation than, someone physically being taken up to a craft that's physically right there and abducted in what should be plain sight, rather than it being a paranormal experience. That seems a little bit more of a plausible explanation to me there. Now, when we're talking about these two schools, with paranormal, extraterrestrial, do they have to be thought of as individual schools, or can both be right at the same time?
They both could be right at the same time. These could be from other galaxies, but not necessarily spaceships in the sense that Steven Spielberg and movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still. We have been so deeply influenced by that genre of art. It's inseparable now. Popular culture is so pervasive. And again, it's an easy response for the debunking mind, or even just the genuine skeptical mind, to say that there is a contagion effect. People who have abductions have read the literature, are familiar with stories like Betty and Barney Hill, the early case in the 1960s, or the American writer Whitley Strieber, who wrote a book called Communion, which was the first person book devoted entirely to his own personal case of, apparently, he would often say, I was abducted by, and he tends to ask more questions of himself than he provides answers. He's had a very skeptical approach to his own experience, but nevertheless, the literature is out there. So the skeptical response is it shapes the thinking of people who have unusual experiences. For example, to what degree is there an overlap? And I ask this with a genuine inquiry, not to be rhetorical, between sleep paralysis, which is a known phenomenon. You find yourself, you are asleep, you wake up, you can't move your body. You are aware of voices in the room. You hear a sense of what appear to be people walking, and you hear maybe groaning noises, almost like a haunting. And that doesn't always have those particular phenomena, but you can't get into your body. You're having a lucid awareness of not being so there's an explanation for sleep paralysis, and it's pretty well understood. Experientially, it can be terrifying, and so to like a Venn diagram. There's the sleep paralysis, and then there's the alien abduction phenomena. There are those who've studied the abduction phenomenon say that the overlap is not as big a Venn diagram as we think. There are differences. So again, these are important. Separate out the differences. You may remember the Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. John Mack, who decades ago, fatefully, if you will, decided to pay attention to this phenomenon. The information. Actually, he'd read an article that I had written based on a talk I had given on the sense in which these abduction phenomena almost parallel the stages that Joseph Campbell described as paradigmatic or representative of rites of passage. These appear to be these abductions. Set aside the question, are they real? Are they actually happening in time and space? Are people being kidnapped by aliens and experimented on? I said, put those, if you can even think of this, put those aside for a moment. I want to make a case. There's some parallels between these events and traditional rites of passage, ceremonies of initiation, where you separate from one identity. For example, in male initiation in indigenous cultures, the boys are taken by men who are actually their own fathers, wearing masks, so they're not recognized. They take the boys away that show what the boys believe. And there are also girl initiations. But I'll just say with the boys. The boys are taken away into these huts, initiatory huts. The mothers cry out in alarm, but the mothers are in on it because the mothers know that it's time for the boys to become men. Believe it or not, there was a time when culture provided ceremonies of initiation for young boys to become men. The military does that to some extent. Getting your first job does that. But in these traditional cultures, it was understood the boys are taken away and placed in huts. So there's a separation phase. There's a middle phase. You're betwixt in between. You're no longer a boy, but you're not yet a man. And then the culmination of the ceremonies, usually involving some feats of prowess that they've got to perform, maybe hunting or fishing. At some point, they go back home. Now they are men. Symbolically, they've got a new ontological status. So I argued that what if we would think of these abductions as a kind of initiation? There are certain parallels. So anyway, John Mack found that piece, and he contacted me. He said, I'm paying attention to this now for whatever reason, and you have some very interesting ideas here, but are they real? Are these really events? You can separate those questions aside for a while and make this initiatory thing, which I think is very provocative. But Keith, are they real? And I said, well, that's the question. Let's talk. So we over a period of years, John Mack and I had some great conversations. And I bring up John Mack because John Mack got it to a point where Harvard said, we're not sure we want you to be doing this kind of research. And he said, are you sure you want to try to forbid me? It's not a threat, but do you understand academic freedom? It was Alan Dershowitz, the American lawyer, said, I'm John Mack. I don't know if I agree with his conclusions about this, but Harvard has a divinity school where it's okay to talk about angels, but not aliens. Do we really want to go down that road? So fortunately, John Mack had other advocates of academic freedom and intellectual pursuits saying, we don't have to agree that John Mack is on the right track. We will agree that he has a right to ask these hard questions.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that Daniel Sheehan did some work with John Mack. I think he was a client of Daniel Sheehan.
He was an attorney.
That's right,
I'll tell you, Danny Sheehan, who said to John, it's funny, Mack, when Harvard began to make clear that they were maybe going to sanction him or penalize him or, I don't know, take away his tenure or take away some of his standing, John said, well, maybe we need to dial this back. Maybe I need to apologize. Maybe I need to make some mea culpa. And Danny said, no. That's not what I recommend. I think we need to ask Harvard, are they really ready to go down this fight? Do they want to join the Vatican knocking on the door of Galileo and said, famously what happened when Galileo was accused of spreading rumors about the universe. He said, you don't have to take my word for it. I have a thing called a telescope. Look through the telescope, look at my computations. It's not a matter of faith. It's not an opinion that the Earth orbits the sun. The Vatican, the officials who knocked on his door, almost Monty Python-like, said, you remember the Spanish Inquisition comedy sketch they did? Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And they said, no, we're not looking through your telescope. We're not going to look through your telescope. We will not avail ourselves of the actual means by which we could falsify your claim or confirm your claim. That ain't science. So Sheehan took the position, John, let's tell Harvard. If they want to go down this road, we'll meet them there and then some. And Harvard thought about it. And they said, "Oh, we never were trying to. We just wanted to make sure that the research was methodologically sound." And Sheehan said, "Fine, we'll give you an out, but let's realize we're on the common ground. This is how we learn about new aspects of nature, by asking the tough questions." And John Mack, he was tragically killed in an automobile accident, and is no longer on the scene, but he asked some good questions. I think back with great affection toward the time I spent talking with him about this kind of subject and the other subjects that relate to pushing the boundaries of known thought and being willing to be explorers.
Ah, that's an amazing story. Speaking of topics then that sort of push boundaries, you mentioned you touched on it earlier, but I want to ask you about it. You mentioned near-death phenomena. Could you expand a little bit on that for us?
Yeah, let's just say right with both the near death. Well, let me talk about the near death phenomenon as a good example of a paradigm of how to explore. The near death phenomenon became prevalent, even though it's in the great literature of the ancients, including Plato, had descriptions of what appeared to be near death, people coming to the edge of death and coming back. It was easy to consider that fantastical, mythological, pre-scientific, and so forth. So it was Raymond Moody, who was the researcher who assembled the book called Life After Life, in which he began to assemble these cases. It turns out that the researchers who began to pay attention to the claims of people who the standard phenomenology is they come to in a surgery situation or in an automobile accident or some other moment of intense threat, existential threat of the end of life, or the fear of death. Death seems imminent. The experiences of leaving the body, consciousness leaves the body, sees the body from above, goes out through very often a tunnel, although that's not a universal feature. Sometimes it's a dark field, goes to a place that seems like a heaven, sees relatives, dead relatives, deceased relatives, including relatives that they never knew, but then they later on identify from photos. Again, the skeptical response is that can all be explained with afterlife, apparent afterlife visions. These do not prove an afterlife. They prove that maybe the DMT in the brain is being released. You're having euphoric, comforting visions. That's sort of the way natural selection has set up so that people who are dying can go out in style. But then there are the moments in which the doctor, for example, the doctor will come into the patient's room the next day after the surgery and says, "Now that you're out of anesthesia, I can tell you what your prognosis is." And the patient says, "Oh, doctor, I already know the prognosis. I overheard your conversation with Dr. Smith in the other wing of the hospital yesterday about noon, and you were eating that tuna sandwich and you got mustard on your tie." Okay. The doctor, picks his jaw up off the floor and says, "What are you talking about?" That's all that happened. So it turns out the best researchers on the near-death experience have been skeptics, have been materialist scientists who never entertained such things, but began to pick up these stories. So in that sense, there's an analogy to the UFO phenomenon. The other analogy is just the idea that if in the near-death phenomenology, it includes experiences of interaction with spirit beings who you recognize as relatives. Well, the beings associated with UFO, the aliens, the grays, the tall whites, there's a whole morphology of non-ordinary humanoid figures that appear to be paraphysical, not entirely of this world. John Mack actually ended up saying, "I think we have to think about this phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, as something that is not of this world as we know it, but intersects with this world under certain circumstances, and then stops intersecting, goes away again." Again, that's a plausible way to think about it, and it also resonates with the ideas that our set of dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time, might be a subset of a larger set of dimensions. String theory says there are either 11 or 26 dimensions. Now, that doesn't mean they're paranormal dimensions. I'm firmly aware of that. But how do we even define what is a dimension? What is the significance of these three dimensions of space and one of time being nested in perhaps 26 dimensions? Certainly opens up room for speculation. So that's some of the, just as a frog, you go into nature, a frog sitting on its lily pad in a swamp has enough cognition in its visual apparatus to be able to stick its tongue out and catch a fly. That's all it needs to do. Do we say that it has full apprehension of its environment the way humans do? No, it's not aware of the books of Shakespeare over here on the shelf inside the house next to the pond. But that frog has enough cognitive ability and so forth to not only catch flies, but most of the time to avoid being being the victim of a predator. So we don't say that the frog sees incorrectly. We say that it sees according to its cognitive capacity, to its apparatus. And likewise, humans, we see correctly. We see more than the frog. We see more than a dog, although we don't hear as much as a dog. So could it be that there are extended senses that might be inherent in humans, and in an evolutionary sense, perhaps we are in fact potentially developing into a more multidimensional human capacity that would make then these UFOs more apparent, whatever they are. Are we meeting on some common ground already? Let's say the abductions, about whether they happen. These abductions, to the extent that they even register as experience, that people experience being levitated through a wall. Okay, phenomenologically, could that be resonant? Could it be understood more clearly when we look at different cultures, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, even Greek, ancient Greek? The idea of subtle bodies, the idea that the physical body is the gross body, and that we have subtle bodies, astral bodies, according to theosophy, causal, different kinds of subtle material. So these are all ways in which the phenomena can find more meaning. But again, there isn't a lot of funding in the current university for these kind of questions. So fortunately, or unfortunately, there are philanthropists. There are a few big time philanthropists who have had some reason to. I have not been the beneficiary of this, by the way, but there are philanthropists who have an interest in these kind of topics, and they sometimes make it possible for research. Lawrence Rockefeller here in the United States was one such philanthropist who had a metaphysical and exploratory interest, and I got to know him and worked with him on some efforts to bring about greater disclosure on the UFO topic.
Yeah, certainly. And I love ideas like these. I love, this idea you've put forward there, this challenging conventional thinking. That's what this show's all about. And I really appreciate, some of these ideas you've been talking about today. And we've talked a lot, we've talked a bit about the theory of the book. And if people want to dive into it, I'll leave links to the book below. They can go and check that out. But what I'd love to move into next is two stories that I know you include in the book you talked about, that I think may interest the people listening now and make them want to look even further. We talked about abductions. There's this one story of the abduction of two men from Mississippi, where a sheriff secretly taped their conversations and was sort of blown away by what he heard. What was the content of that tape then that blew the sheriff away?
That's a great question. The two men were Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker, two southern Mississippi boys. You don't get much more southern in the United States. If you're south of Pascagoula, you're in the Gulf of Mexico, and you better be in a boat. I mean, it's called the Deep South. And these were just conventional, ordinary guys that went fishing one night in 1973. And Calvin was considerably younger than Charlie. He was a friend of Charlie's son. But these guys went fishing every time they could. They lived to fish. So they walked onto a piece of property, and Calvin said, by the way, it's hard for me not to do their accents because I spent Calvin.
Please do.
So with that, as maybe give me a little freedom here, Calvin said to Charlie, he said, I think we're on private property. I see a sign that says no trespassing. You're fixing to get us both arrested. This is probably not the best place we ought to be fishing, Charlie. Don't worry, Calvin. The police never come back here. And I say that with, great respect. I love the sound of that voice, and it gives me a chance to do some impressions. In any case, they're standing on the dock and looking out on the water. Some blue lights were flashing, and Calvin said, "Well, I told you, and the police is right here. You can see them lights flashing." They turned around. Well, the police would have been a much better outcome. It wasn't the police; it was a craft. I just say an apparent craft, and so, but I'm just going to call it a craft. That's how they reported it, and a non-ordinary, a saucer type, or oblong, etc. And they were immediately paralyzed with fear, and maybe paralyzed with some other force. A door opened up seamlessly. Out came two creatures that didn't actually fit the standard alien look. They were more like, he called them creatures. They picked up the guys. They floated inside the craft. It was one of the first of the abductions where some kind of a procedure was performed, some kind of examination. Then they were placed back 20 minutes later, placed back on the dock. The ship left, and it actually just disappeared. Again, certain aspects of this suggest a paranormal, maybe a fugue state, some kind of shared dissociative state. Listen, I know my stuff. I've looked into all the psychological phenomena of disassociation. I would love to find conventional explanations to all of this. And then I'd feel like I can make a claim to knowledge. So in any case, I was aware of this case at the time. So in the process of working on the book, I went down to Pascagoula to get to know Calvin Parker, who has since passed away. He was in his 70s at the time. But you're referring to that moment. They're on the dock. Calvin or Charlie, the older one, said, "Well, we need to spend a few minutes before we decide what to do about what had just happened." I mean, that's putting it mildly. They were both just deeply shaken by whatever they had experienced. Calvin said, "Well, there's nothing we're going to do. What we're going to do is get up tomorrow morning and go to work. And we're not going to do anything that will displace our ability to have employment. I just got this job." He was very aware of what it would mean to report this. The idea that these guys, that you have these experiences and you're looking for attention, you're looking for Hollywood. Yeah. Hollywood may find you, but it is not a great career path to claim something like this in hopes of becoming a millionaire star of movies. So, long story short, he told Calvin, "I will call the police. So you don't have to. You can say you passed out if you want." So in any case, the police said, "You're abducted by aliens." All right, well, come on in. We'll talk. They were clearly skeptical. They went in middle of the night and they separated them. They talked with them for hours. They said, "Tell us again what happened, Charlie." "Okay, tell us again one more time." "I've told you 12 versions of this. It's always the same every time. When can I go home? I don't even want to be here now." Long story short, the sheriff, being kind of a cagey guy, a good law enforcement official, he finally said, "Okay, one more time. I'm going to put you guys together, get you some coffee, and I'll be right back." And what he had done was place a voice-activated tape recorder in a location. The idea being, put these guys finally in the same room together, and if they do what I think they'll do, he thought, they'll say, "Well, we really pulling the wool over these guys' eyes. The story is going really well, don't you think?" But instead, they heard two men describing terror. I have the full transcript in my book. One of them said, "I always thought maybe there was something up there, but I never thought it would come here like it did. I can't catch my breath." And he said, "I need a drink. And I need sleeping pills. I know, why would such a thing happen?" Calvin was weeping. A young Calvin, 18 years old. So the sheriff then listened to this tape, said these boys are telling about an experience that they've had. And the experience is real. He made that distinction. They've had a real experience. I cannot claim what what would have been seen by other witnesses. So I went down to Pascagoula, spent time with him, and interesting little piece of this story. Calvin Parker not only did not want attention for this, he became known as the guy who went up in the flying saucer or was taken into the flying. It is not a life path that he wanted. He prayed that it could turn back the time on the hands of the clock, and it would never happen. So he decided to start going by the name of Randy. He didn't change his name legally. He named Randy Jones, let's say. He changed his name in order not to be associated with it. So about 5 or 6 years ago, he and his wife were going to a funeral, and they signed the guest book. He signed it absentmindedly, Calvin Parker. And the person behind him said, "Oh, you're Calvin Parker. Oh, this here's Calvin Parker." And both Calvin and his wife said, "Well, this isn't right. We're at a man's memorial service. This is not right for this to be." We walked out into the parking lot, and his wife said to him, "Calvin, it's time for you to write that book. You've got to come out and say what." Do you know, to that day, he had never even told his wife the whole story. She had never asked him. She said, "He'll tell me when he wants to tell me." And he told me, he said, "Mr. Thompson, can you imagine what it's like? I don't know what kind of relationships you've had. Can you imagine what it's like living with a woman for more than 20 years and not talking about that? It takes a toll." So I told my wife, I went home that night, I told her the full story. And we had tears and we embraced. And I just had been asked by a publisher to write a book. It was very synchronous, if you will. He wrote the book. So when he wrote the book under his own name, he was finishing his rite of passage. He was, in my terms, finishing the initiatory process that had taken him up. He'd responded to the call. His life's calling. It's not what he had chosen, but is what happened to him. So he met the call. When he wrote the book and appeared in bookstores down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, people came, "Calvin Parker's out with a book. I've been looking for this guy for years. He was hiding as Randy. No one knew what had happened to Calvin Parker." This is like a Hollywood movie. If there's a screenwriter out there, take this story and run with it, because it's, Daniel Day-Lewis or someone should be in it, but not for the reason that people think. He didn't set out to write a Hollywood blockbuster. So in any case, people came to the book reading and took him aside and said, "I remember that night. I saw lights myself, and I kept it to myself because I saw how you guys were ridiculed." So other witnesses came forward. So it is almost a Hollywood ending, that he died with the knowledge that there were others who'd seen what he'd seen. I asked him, I said, "What was it like, Calvin, being so systematically disbelieved?" He said, "I understand why the doubters doubt. I would have doubted what I was claiming too. As you know, every time you've asked me, I've given you the same account of the story. I haven't added anything. My story's pretty boring to me now. I could have embellished it. I guess that's the term that they use, embellish your story, but it doesn't make it any better if I add details that didn't happen." He had a real common sense integrity about him. And he said, I understand why people don't believe until you have it happen yourself. I can understand the skeptical response. And even now, Mr. Thompson, I don't know what happened to me and Charlie that day, but I know something happened. It was not normal, not anything normal. That's all life. And to me, that had the feeling of an authenticity about it.
Yeah.
And finally, where I come with all of this is that, and what's the human factor in these events? That's what moves me.
Certainly. And again, just to reiterate, that the most compelling part of that for me is whether you believe it happened or not, as whether you believe it was a genuine UFO experience. I think the fact that he didn't want the limelight, didn't want to be associated with it, could have easily used that to bear fruit in whether it's media appearances or writing a book earlier or documentaries. I think that gives it that level of it is a genuine experience. Whatever that experience was, it was genuine to him at the time, because there are a lot of people out there, a lot of famous UFO stories that I think lose credibility in how often that person has appeared in the media, how many documentaries they've made on themselves, how many books they've written or movies there's been. So I think that is the most compelling part of that for me.
Well, interesting, of the two men, Calvin, who was younger, Charlie was older. It turned out that Charlie, and I say this with respect, I never met him, but he actually went the path of sort of becoming a UFO celebrity. And he went to UFO meetings and would sign books and sign stuff. And it's not to suggest that his account of it would be any less plausible, but it feeds into the idea that he had a secondary interest in that happening.
One other story I'd just love to ask you about that our listeners may not be familiar with before we start to wrap up. Can you tell us a little bit about the Zimbabwe 1994 UFO experience? What happened there, and why was that so compelling?
Sure. What happened there? I'll just move through it quickly, and maybe more quickly than the previous story. a school called the Ariel School, Ariel, for those who want to look it up. Private school. I think it's a religious school, or had a religious orientation in the region of Zimbabwe. Primarily Caucasian students, but not entirely. A successful school. Anyway, one day at recess, just interestingly, just as these things go, almost out of a magical realism type film, right? Like Field of Dreams or so forth. There's a normal, realistic setting. Everything's fine. Kids are sent out for recess. They notice something off in the distance. It is, again, a craft that is hovering, that breaks into, at one point it appears there might be multiple craft. The kids begin to scream and shout and run around. The teachers really are all in a meeting. Perfect, right? I mean, that split, perfect. The skeptics would say too perfect.
Yeah.
Because the kids, we know the imaginations of kids. Well, we do know imaginations of kids, but anyway, as it emerged, a young girl named Emily Trim, 8 years old, got closer to the craft, and a being came out of the craft with captivating black eyes, a non-ordinary, not humanoid, but not apparently human. They locked eyes, and she felt mind to mind. She called it, she didn't have the word for it. She said, I got images that the earth was in danger, that we have to be careful with our environment. What a remarkable thing to claim that of all the things that the kids are going to confabulate on. And by the way, the other children, when they were separated from each other, had the same thing. They had these intuitive, uncanny explanations that they were being given information. In any case, they went inside and called the teachers. This is what happened. This is what happened. The response was, oh, the kids are just active imagination. But there were other teachers who saw something too. And then the BBC reported that there was some kind of craft that was seen. So it began to be the biggest. 65 children had seen this, and they were separated by and large. And not at first. They were interviewed together at first, which is, problematic because they might build on each other's story. But they were finally separated. They drew pictures. I include them in my book. Drew pictures of these craft that were all somewhat similar, but all somewhat different. And there was another case that John Mack got very active in from Harvard, flew down to Zimbabwe. And so there were many features. This was, and for me, this is a remarkable case in that the quality of the evidence, the quality of the sightings was quite remarkable. And yet, because they're children, because there weren't many, and there are no adults to corroborate it, it was almost as if the children said, "Isn't it interesting that the adults were all inside? It makes it possible for us, our accounts to be minimized." Very wise. In any case, here's what I found similar interest as to the Pascagoula case. Young Emily was from a family that was conventionally Christian, very conservative Christian theologically, and a mother and father said, Emily, what you say happened, that didn't happen. Wow. That's one really harsh way to put it. That's one way to say it didn't happen. This doesn't happen. God loves us. It doesn't happen in God. It's not part of the plan. So they eventually took Emily and her brother, who also saw these events and described them, took them out of school, went back home to Canada to get away from it. Perfect, right? It's the same thing in the middle of her own rite of passage through this, whatever level of reality. But I think it was pretty substantially physical reality, at least, and with involving paranormal dimensions, including this telepathic communication. In any case, she went back to Canada. Family took her home, and she wasn't doing well for several years because she was living with this thing that was unfinished. Now, any kind of a trauma that is unfinished is not going to resolve itself automatically. There has to be some engagement. So she received a letter of invitation. Hey, Emily, how are you doing? We're your fellow classmates. We're having the 25th anniversary of the school this summer. Could you come back? I know it's far away. Emily put that letter down and she said, I need to go back. So there was a sense of something calling her, and she was fortunate that she listened to that part of her psyche. Her parents said, go back. We'll support you. Well, by that time, her parents had come to realize maybe they had overreacted and by dismissing. So Emily went back, and one of the teachers said, would you like to meet with the local shaman, the local wise man? You never met any of the local spiritual indigenous teachers. And Emily said, I would. How did we happen to go to school here and never make any communication? with the local indigenous. She'd grown. Her psyche had become more mature. She was interested in these topics. So she went to see a man named Duke, who was from some shamanic culture, if you will. And he said, "So what have you come to ask me?" And she said, "Well, I want to know what I should do with what happened. Do you want to know if you should talk about it?" She said, "Well, yes, stuttered and stammered. Yes, I want, of course you should talk about it. It's part of your experience. You were a girl, you were a child. It is out of the mouths of children that we need to hear things. You don't have to have you don't have to understand it all. Tell what happened. Tell it directly. Speak your truth." And so her parents had said, "Don't speak of that." And this spiritual indigenous teacher said, "Shout it. Not just speak it, but shout it from the hills." So she did. She listened. She finished something important in her psyche. She was a young artist. She went back to Canada. Her artwork began to flourish. She had been drawing pictures prior to this, pictures of the original event in black and white that were very somber. She began to draw them in color. So almost like the movie Pleasantville. I don't know if you've ever seen it, where the children, two young people are transported in time, a time travel type story, back to a time like the 50s. Everything was in black and white. And that the culmination of the story was when that became full color and they began to get their full dimensionality back. So Emily got her full dimensionality back. She began to live with this experience. So again, this to me is ultimately, these are spiritual in the broadest sense of the word. Okay. These are spiritual. There's a spiritual dimension to this. Doesn't require belief in religion. Now, you can make a distinction between religion and spirituality for sure. One of the most common categories in demographic polls, spiritual but not religious. Large number of people identify with some sense of a larger purpose and meaning that can be called spiritual, but that it doesn't reduce to any particular religious model. And it's very consistent with science. One definition I heard recently: quantum physics is where they hide the scientific part of spirituality. Because what's going on in quantum physics is very, very wild stuff about interconnectedness, photons from, the entangled particles experiment, photons separated by great distance but remaining in touch. It sort of says that the quantum level, if that is indeed the undergirding of our reality, there's deep non-local communication going on all the time. And maybe these events, UFO, psychic, near death, are breakthroughs into that larger realm that are momentary, temporary. And maybe the ultimate idea is we're going to develop into that greater dimensionality where those phenomena will become normal.
Yes, the quantum physics, typically where the sort of superdeterminism argument sort of falls apart, where rules don't quite exist and things are sort of tied together on assumptions and imaginary numbers. So yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think one that perfectly encapsulates all the things you talk about in your book and your wider work. For people that they've heard those stories, they listen to this show today, they think, I want more from Keith, I want to check out this book. Where's the best place for everyone listening and watching right now to go to find the book, to connect with yourself and maybe more of your work?
Well, thanks. The best place is hopefully your local bookstore. I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. I like to see them thrive, so maybe order it there. It is now available on all the big sites, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, and my own website has information about ordering. It also has more information about my work. So let me put that out. It's www.thompsonatlarge.com. Thompson with the P, THOMPSON, at large, spelled out, .com. Keith Thompson, UFO, turns out to be enough of a search term these days. I didn't set out to identify myself with UFOs, but you follow your path as a journalist. I'll leave this one thought. Someone recently asked me that, Keith, I've read your early journalism. You covered criminal justice, you covered education, you covered homeschooling, you covered lots of societal things. How did you go from being an investigative journalist to a UFO researcher? And I thought, what is it that isn't quite right about that question? Investigative journalist, and then I became a UFO researcher. I said, no, I remained an investigative journalist. I just began to look at UFOs. And I fortunately love that question because I framed it. I'm not a UFO researcher. I'm not a ufologist. I don't know what that is, but there is such a term field calls itself ufology. And it keeps the conversation small and secular. To become an expert on UFOs is to become an expert in a small world. I'm not an expert. You know, the Zen master and Zen Buddhist master Suzuki Roshi had a famous phrase in his book, Beginner's Mind. He said, in the beginner's mind are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. What he was saying was, if you're an expert on something, it's not to diminish the value of expertise, but one kind of expertise is a place where there's not many possibilities left because you know everything, right? You think you know everything. If you're an expert, there's not much left to wonder. But a beginner, I'm open to asking big questions. In a beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. I don't provide final answers on these topics, but I just try to say, follow the evidence wherever it leads. And, it doesn't require belief, but believe what the evidence seems to suggest, and then be willing to question your hypotheses. This is how I remain a learner. And I think it's a good approach to other areas besides these kind of exotic topics.
I love that. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. You mentioned that you're an investigative journalist that sort of followed the findings, and you've now become associated with UFOs, but you didn't set out in that way. So I know, as an audience member, as a reader, as a digester of your information, that you're not coming at this with an agenda. You're simply just following what's in front of you. And, now you're writing this book as a result of those findings. So I can tell it's coming from a genuine place, which makes me infinitely more curious. I will, as we mentioned there, your website, Thompson at Large, I will link in the show notes below, so everyone can go and click that. I'll leave links to any social media or links to the book on Amazon, etc., for people to click and check out. But Keith, thank you today. It has been an absolute pleasure. I think that the work you do is extremely fascinating and very original. It's not really a topic that many people have explored. And so I thank you for that. And I thank you for bringing that curiosity to the show and our audience today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation, and I appreciate the invitation to spend this time with you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please subscribe to the Freedom Pack channel and consider clicking here to watch another video that I think you'll enjoy.